Hello and welcome to this week's What Were They Thinking? Among the news items we have for you this week, a 66-year-old German woman has given birth to her 10th child and claims not to have had any assistance such as IVF. A fungal infection has seen a significant increase in the number of hospitalizations, leading to concerns about it being dangerous, well, more so than it already is. The world's smallest pacemaker is about the size of a grain of rice. A 30-year study claims to have found the best diet to prevent aging, although possibly not happiness. A Venus flytrap anatomy-like insect found inside amber. One reason why teens take significantly more risk than adults. A half-ice, half-fire phase of matter involving magnets. And possibly finding microbes on the dark side of the moon. The timestamps for these and other news items can be found in the description box below. Let's start with superior German genetics. No wait, last time somebody said that, fancy mustaches went out of fashion and America went to war over something other than oil and communism. But it's somewhat true. The 66-year-old German woman has given birth to her 10th child, and, this is rather important, she claims not to have any kind of reproductive assistance, other than the sex kind. But this is weird because, typically speaking, once you hit 30, the, let's say, not only ability to carry a child to term, but getting pregnant in the first place, sees a decline. Once you hit 40 to 50, that opportunity is basically gone. So to have a child at 66 is fairly significant. Now, we do have issues with this beyond the fact that, late-stage pregnancies like this at her age are an incredibly dangerous idea. We also have concerns that the child will become an orphan before they become an adult. Given the average life expectancy in Germany, and the fact that they're already 66 now, by the time the child is 18 or 21, depending on exactly what law you're going to try and apply, there's a good chance the mother will be dead. And, of course, dead parents don't parent very well. Just ask your father after he went out to get milk and cigarettes and hasn't come back. There are also going to be some serious, questionable family dynamics going on here. Given the oldest child is 46 and the youngest is, now 0, but previously 2. Having a 44-year age gap between you and next relative is pretty damn significant and is going to put a big strain on any kind of dynamic. There is a decent probability that not only the number of children, but the extensive time frame over which she's had them has contributed to the fact she remains fertile despite being relatively elderly. And also a future orphan mother. Next we have another woman, but this time rather more useful in terms of a case study. It's a brain implant that's allowed the conversion of thoughts into speech and in almost practical real time. Now, brain-computer interfaces are basically just implants into the brain that then go to a computer. Whether they're wired or wireless, it doesn't make a great deal of difference. The key difference between this device and others is how it works in detail. That is, rather than just predicting what's going on in the brain and then acting on it, it's actually reading short 80 millisecond sections of brain activity and synthesizing this into voice activity, or in this case sound. Depending on what you think of their ability to speak now, you may wish that they never gained the ability, much like when you have a toddler who learns how to speak and asks the question why all the time. You just think, I wish you had never learnt that. And this may eventually apply to the people who know this woman who are used to her saying nothing prior to now. But that doesn't mean the technology itself is completely useless. It is not only relevant to somebody like this who had a stroke and therefore wasn't able to speak properly, but it could be useful for all sorts of other scenarios where speech impediments are a significant issue. In theory at least, we've been able to get around that barrier of not being able to speak for decades now. It's just been a very long time to do so. And we don't mean as in the projects have taken forever, we mean just being able to make words has taken a very long time. Where this is considered a breakthrough is the speed at which the speech can be translated from thought to verbal sound. As mentioned, we're talking milliseconds at this point. This allows for a great deal more engagement and actual conversation versus what could be kindly described as a sort of a push button or connect forward approach to speech, where it takes you forever to try and link together different aspects of what you're saying. The only thing left to worry about with this particular device is that, unlike with previous devices, let's say, you had to attempt to vocalize the sounds, which could be very awkward and uncomfortable. This instead just requires people to think about what they're trying to say. And of course, this could lead to a whole raft of Freudian slips that are arguably very embarrassing and uncomfortable. What's just as uncomfortable are fungal infections, and in this case we are talking specifically about a fairly common fungus, Candida auris. This is otherwise known as thrush, so that's not great already. It's a common fungus and the CDC is ringing alarm bells about it. At least they would be if they had money to pay for bells at the moment. Instead, they're probably in the street corners screaming, "We'll work for alarm about particular new disease," or, in this case, particular new fungal pathogen. The concerns may not actually be quite so bad, though. The reason we say this is that the reports are based on a huge jump between 2019 and 2023 in Miami, Florida. Now, accounting for everything else, you have things like spring break and the sheer number of elderly individuals who retire there and are still horny, and going from 5 to 115 cases in roughly 4 years isn't that surprising. Arguably, it's to be expected. But on top of that, though, the concern here is not so much the sheer rise, it's the sheer rise in the need to treat regularly, and therefore the rise in medication-resistant fungi. Despite their name, they are neither fun nor guys. Unlike our next interesting disease and findings, there's no way to really prevent Candida auris. There is, however, a way, at least to some extent, to protect yourself from shingles, and this could have more effects than just preventing you from being really itchy and being sore all over. A shingles vaccine, if used effectively, could, and understand this is very preliminary, greatly reduce the effect and protect you from the risk of dementia. Now, depending on what exact state of dementia somebody's in, they may not even be aware of the fact they have it, or they may not remember they need to get the shingles vaccine, or they even have shingles. But, nonetheless, the varicella zoster virus is particularly nasty. What makes it nasty is one simple thing. It enters the nervous system, and then, in the process of invading it, essentially creates a home. Much like Germany entering Poland. It just rolls on through and decides this is now our land. The difference between the Germans invading Poland and varicella zoster invading your nervous system is that the chickenpox virus, or shingles virus in this case, goes dormant, and will only re-emerge after a prolonged period wherein you have issues around the ability to contain it. Typically speaking, things like stress, another disease that causes the immune system to falter, things like that. The reason the evidence is argued to be fairly clear-cut is that they kinda have a control study, but not really. It is entirely observational. What they've done is take Welsh citizens who were eligible to get the vaccine and those who weren't, and looked at a period each side a couple of weeks of exactly when the cutoff date was for when you were eligible or not eligible. If you were born too early, well, you're shit out of luck. If you were born late enough, you were eligible. This led to roughly 282,000 people, and when they compared the number of people who were diagnosed with dementia after the vaccines were issued, so they've ignored everybody who already had dementia, they found that being vaccinated for shingles lowered the risk of dementia by about 20%, which sounds promising, but remembering that this is almost entirely, if not absolutely, observational. And, well, it'll be rather hard to do controlled clinical trials because, well, first of all, you'd have to deny people access to the vaccine, which technically they've done here, but you'd also technically have to give people dementia, which that's where the ethics board tends to get a bit hung up, unless they're German, in which case they don't get hung up, they go into the closet. The only sort of, let's say, mitigating factor when we talk about this is simply that the results can be replicated in other countries where a similar kind of rollout for the vaccine was conducted, in places like England, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and so on. So it's not like the findings are only isolated to Wales, but they are still somewhat limited in how useful they can be considered. More useful, assuming everything goes as planned, is the world's smallest pacemaker. It's just barely the size of a grain of sand, if not a little bit small again. Now, this is particularly important for several reasons, and first of all, it's because getting it into the heart, or close enough to work, is incredibly easy by comparison to open heart surgery, for instance. So, naturally, being able to get something so small and functional is brilliant. Again, though, we need to come back to the point of if it works as intended. This is where the device's application is somewhat distinct and different from what are otherwise called permanent pacemakers that you would be more familiar with when it comes to the elderly or those with heart problems. This device is intended for children who are born with congenital heart defects, and the key thing here is that they only need a temporary pacemaker for about a week after the surgery. That's why it's so small and arguably so easily implanted, along with being relatively temporary. It's still somewhat permanent, but removing it is much easier. The other advantage to this is, as mentioned, the administration. You can basically administer it using a syringe. It's literally that tiny, and it is wireless, therefore naturally better, unless you're trying to get high speed, in which case Ethernet always. Once you've injected this small pacemaker into the baby, you then put a sort of adhesive patch on the baby's chest, and this is where you then attach all your electrodes to. And this allows communication between whatever device you're using to control it and the pacemaker itself. What other feature to this that makes it far more effective, at least in respect of babies, is that it doesn't require an internal battery. Your obvious question is going to be, well then, how does it work as a pacemaker? Because that requires some sort of power, and, well, simply put, it relies on the fact that the body is essentially a one giant protein bag filled with an electrolyte solution. That electrolyte solution allows for a change in, essentially, voltage between different things, and it's basically a galvanic cell, a battery if you will. And that means you can turn the energy from that giant battery that is the human body into electrical pulses that will then stimulate the heart. Going now to dietary news, we have claims that yogurt could lower your risk of bowel cancer. Now, this is a very, very bold claim. Very bold. And as such, it needs a lot more evidence to support it than what's been presented. But because of the sheer rise in, well, in this case, we're talking mostly about intestinal and similar cancers, you kinda have to look at anything that'll do the job. In this case, small improvements could be achieved, but only in very narrow and very tailored context. That context being, you need to consume 2 or more servings of yogurt per week, and only certain kinds of aggressive colorectal cancer risk goes down. This is essentially cherry-picking out those particular cancers and saying, look, all cancer goes down. It's not going to hold for very long, especially once you start looking at the details. To summarize the findings quite simply, if you are at risk of something called bifidobacterium-positive proximal colon cancer, then yes, eating more yogurt will be good for you, because that's basically the only thing it really had any benefit for. And even within that, there were roughly 3,000 people who had cancer within that time frame out of the 150,000 who were in the study, and within that, only some again saw benefit. So, yeah, this is getting very, very specific very quickly. It could be argued that you are better off simply eating a diet higher in fiber and more healthy than you are trying to consume more yogurt. In terms of other diets that are better for your aging health, we have a claim that there is one kind of diet that is better than all the others. And, well, this is going to be an interesting dive into dietary preferences. The diet that Harvard examined is called the Alternative Healthy Eating Index, and it basically tells you to do exactly what every other diet has ever told you to do that's not gone off the deep end of crazy. Eat more fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, legumes, and healthy fats. Essentially, just have a healthy, balanced diet. You know the whole food pyramid thing? Yeah. It also tells you to eat less red meat, processed meats, sugary drinks, and reduce salt. Again, none of this is particularly surprising. It's also not a particularly enjoyable diet, as is one of the major reasons that most diets will fail. People either get bored with it, find that it's just not something they enjoy eating, or it's just too constrictive. Now, at least with this, the last of these is not a major concern. All of the major food groups are available to you, and as long as you're consuming meat within moderation, it doesn't look to be that bad. But this does bring us, however, to what could be described as the Achilles heel of all of this, which, given that we're talking about exercise and health and well-being, might be an apt analogy to make. There were over 105,000 people involved in the study, but just under 10,000 of them met the health criteria at age 70. This means the study had a less than 10% success rate in terms of people implementing good diets. In dietary advice that we cannot recommend, coffee enemas. Coffee goes in your mouth, not your anus. If you need someone to explain this to you, you are clearly not understanding what coffee is and how it works. The magic of coffee is that it goes in your mouth, which means you get caffeine in your GI tract. Caffeine goes to your brain, and then you're productive and awake, and can deal with people. This is where the conversation article is somewhat useful, although it seems unlikely anybody who's actually doing this would bother to read it, in that no, coffee does not go in your rectum, and it doesn't go in there because any vague possible health benefits you might loosely get, and mostly it'll be loose stool, are mitigated by the drastic increase in risk of something like a perforation in your rectum, which would then lead to feces going into your abdominal or pelvic cavity, and then you have poop filled bacteria spreading throughout your inside. This is on top of a range of other health risks that are associated with coffee enemas. You are, as we mentioned earlier, far better off just having a diet higher in fiber than you are engaging in this kind of crazy behavior. In slightly more weird human and environmental news, we have certain drugs can actually turn the human bloodstream into poison for mosquitoes, not only controlling the mosquito population, for example with places that have high malaria incidence, this would be brilliant, but also to a certain extent helping you and get back at those little bitey bastards for trying to snack on you. The drug is called nitisinone, and it's a drug that is, well, at this stage, not particularly well used because, well, there's not many uses for it. But at a very low dose, it's deadly to mosquitoes. Now, this sounds like it's already a fairly straightforward situation. That is, you use nitisinone and you give it to people at a low dose and suddenly no more mosquitoes. And since it's already been approved for certain genetic disorders, getting it approved for this application might be somewhat easier. The downside is, well, obviously you're using a drug that's already been approved for something, meaning that it's obviously got a certain profile, and that profile means that it will have a certain byproducts, metabolites, and so on, but also a certain, well, let's be blunt about it, side effects to the human that's consuming it. But to use a simple comparison, you have certain treatments that are used for other diseases, and these other diseases, malaria being an example, tend to, well, let's be blunt about this, the side effects are nasty. You feel very, very rough from taking them, and you have to take them the entire time you're exposed to the possible threat of the parasitic agent or, let's say, disease, and you have to start taking it before you even are exposed to it. So it's obviously very limited in how useful it can be. Strangely, this drug's also being compared to ivermectin, which ivermectin has a similar sort of benefit in that it can kill off mosquitoes. However, ivermectin requires lower doses but is slower to work, whereas this requires a higher dose but acts much more quickly. So it's a balancing act as to which is more beneficial in terms of its functionality, and that may come down to a personal decision as to what you consider more important. A higher dose and therefore arguably more symptoms, or a lower dose but certainly more exposure for longer to certain, well, in this case, mosquitoes. In other insect-related news, we have a weird anatomy, let's call it, in a particular wasp. The wasp is found in a lump of amber, and the lump of amber is from 99 million years ago. What is inside of it is a wasp that butt cheeks are essentially a Venus flytrap. There's the idea of having a big booty, but a big booty that can expand and contract at will is probably a bit different to what people had in mind. Even more alarming, let's call it, is the theory as to why the bizarre Venus flytrap type buttocks exists with this wasp. It's not for the wasp itself to eat its prey, rather it's for its offspring to eat its prey, from the inside out. Yes, that is nightmare fuel. Not only are you trapped in something's butt, but you're being eaten by its babies as they claw their way out from inside you. The other possible approach to this is also related to that, but rather than just holding onto the host permanently so the baby wasp can eat its way out, instead it's only a temporary way of holding onto the poor unsuspecting victim, similar in some respects to, say, a facehugger, wherein it temporarily holds on to the victim, allows for the host to be impregnated? That's probably the best word for this, with the egg of the wasp larvae, and then released to going on its merry way, thinking it's free and just barely escaped its death, only to be horrifically broken open, like a chest burster not much later, and probably quite painfully so. Shifting to a slightly larger scale topic about the environment, it's the consequences of orcas hunting down sharks in the oceans. We've mentioned this, but the southern hemisphere is a terrifying place. At least off the coasts of South Africa, Australia, and parts of South America, orcas are hunting down and killing sharks and stealing their livers, like a serial killer. And this is not so awesome. It's kind of awesome if you don't like the idea of sharks, but, well, given that orcas are more closely related to a dolphin than they are a shark, or a whale for that matter, it's fair to think that they're probably just doing this because they're assholes. The consequences are kind of not great for the environment, and we say kind of not great as removing the various shark species has led to the apex predator basically buggering off because it's gone, I don't want to risk being killed by some asshole orca, I'm just going to go find somewhere else to be. Then, all the species that it would have previously predated on have ballooned, and because of that, and the fact that the orcas don't really hunt these other species for the most part, they end up deciding to just keep on growing as a population, and that then has effects on whatever they feed on, because now there's no control of their predators. And the pyramid downwards from the sharks begins to collapse. The exact definitive relationship between these events isn't necessarily there, though. It's more a case of, through monitoring of various sightings of different creatures and basically an animal census, or in this case a fish census, it's pretty clear that everything was going pretty well until 2015, and then in 2015 the sightings started to fall off very quickly. And in 2015 the victims of the orca serial killers also started to show up, so it's kinda hard not to find some relationship between this. It is entirely possible at this stage that the ecosystem will at least somewhat return to normal in the near future, but certainly not in the next few years. It will take some time, if it does return to normal. Shifting to more psychology news than anything else, it's why it is that teenagers enjoy taking risks so much more than other people do. And it's not just because they're going through puberty and therefore not only hormonal, but horny. No, it has to do with their brains as well. And it's weirdness. Essentially, humans are a species that, well, we undergo adolescence, but in a weird way. Consider, if you will, how adolescent monkeys are lions in their prides, wolves in packs, elephants in herds, and any other creature. As they enter into puberty, typically speaking, they become more restrained and arguably more mature, not only because they're soon to be kicked out and have to find their own way in the world, but also because if they don't, the more senior members of whatever group it is will probably give them hell. In humans, however, adolescent humans do more and more dumb shit. Sometimes funny, like the Tide Pod challenge, sometimes just plain dumb. The neuroscientists believe that there is a particular circuit within the brain, that's a particular set of neurons and networking in the brain itself, that is responsible for the increased risk-taking, at least amongst humans. And what they believe is responsible is the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex. This brings us to the research itself, which, at least initially, is kind of dodgy. It's dodgy for a simple reason. They relied on training mice to respond to a stimuli, that's a beeping sound to tell them that they're about to get shocked. So the food that they're currently being able to gorge on should probably be left alone so they can jump to a safe platform. After the beep goes away, they can go back to eating quite happily. Adolescent and otherwise young mice decided that no, they would hold on as long as possible, oftentimes to a shocking result. This is, at least in theory, why the neuroscientists believe, after they inject fluorescent molecules into the mouse brains, that if they follow what's going on, that the brain's ability to communicate with 3 distinct sections of the brain, and to understand that this is the risk, this is the reward, and this is the action taken, they just don't follow that very well. It's, rather than being a nice clean straight line between these, it takes a more sort of meandering and lackadaisical route to get there. Shifting to more technology related news now, we have protecting your eyes from the various effects of looking at a screen. Whether it is staring intently at your phone on the toilet, never turning off TikTok, or having to read an ebook constantly. No matter what it is, it can have an effect on your eyes. Now, the most obvious effects are going to be things like causing short-sightedness or long-sightedness, or otherwise known as eye strain. And this is somewhat more important given the sheer increased number of people who work in a role that basically has them spending all day staring at a computer screen. That's not great, and more so with most people now working, at least partly, remotely, and if not remotely, certainly in an environment where that's more of an issue. The conversation article goes through the issues that are associated with our ever-increasing not only dependence, but use of various kinds of screens, and we'll leave that to you to read if you're so interested. Shifting to more exotic news, and in this case exotic applies to the state of matter rather than just being an interesting and different idea. It's, let's call it research, coming out of the Brookhaven National Laboratory in the United States of America. What they've found is a thing, let's call it, that's half fire, half ice. And it's also really, really bizarre. It's a mixture of strontium, copper, iridium, and oxygen. And so long as you have it in the right environment, it's able to basically behave like both things. This new product might also be the next Pokemon. The way this weird and bizarre thing works is, in a very simple way of putting it, by having the atoms either on the copper side, which causes them to be more like fire, or on the iridium side, in which case they're more like ice, they're able to create a weird magnetic scenario. And when you start fiddling with this, and particularly at very specific temperatures, things go weird quickly. Further, depending on exactly what temperature you choose to set the system at, it could choose to switch these over. So rather than having the bits behaving like ice, they behave like fire, and inversely, the fire parts behave like ice. Even with that, the researchers themselves admit they have no idea what application their findings have. Which, yeah, that's not actually that surprising for a lot of research. In a far more practical and real-world application of research, we have China has licensed 2 companies to get started with flying taxis. No, we are not living in the future, this is actually now. Well, actually it was the future not that long ago, and now it's the now. That gets confusing quickly. Ehang Holdings is one of the 2 companies that have been given permission to start their weird drone taxi service. It's allowing for urban transportation and it could, if things work well, and there's a lot of questions about that, provide for decongesting roads because, well, they're flying, they're not going on roads. The big challenge is that, well, to be blunt about this, small aircraft have a very bad reputation. Statistically, if you are using a small aircraft, such as, well, a plane or similar, you have a far higher risk of an accident. And, well, that's basically what we're worried about here with this particular certification. Even though they've gone through all of the hurdles, done all the testing and so on, it still seems fairly likely that there's going to be a problem here. The arguably very thin silver lining is that, unlike regular small aircraft, which often use aviation fuel, this instead is entirely electrical. So rather than having to worry about fuel being spilled everywhere and burning or worse yet environmental disasters from it, you instead have to worry about, well, possibly fire from the batteries, but at least it's going to be relatively contained. The vehicles are fully electric, they have no pilot, and they can hold up to 2 people. Now, they do use 16 propellers and are largely made out of carbon fibre, and go up to 100 km per hour, or somewhere around the range of 60 miles per hour, and fly out up to 3,000 meters high. If this all goes well, this could be the next major Uber-type thing, at least in regards to China, but also possibly it could be a massive flop. Shifting now to news that comes from out of Earth, we have the possibility of microbes on the moon, and that these could be a problem. Understand there's a lot of, let's call it hyperbole there, but there is a certain amount of concern, at least coming out of the USA and Canada, that microbes that can survive forever on the moon could theoretically come back to Earth, and because they're so adjusted to surviving in extremely adverse environments, well, they could basically find Earth to be a paradise, which is somewhat funny given that Earth is typically seen as a hell world. It's why Earth is basically seen as Space Australia and most discussions of it. What worries the scientists involved is simply this. There is a good chance that, not only because they're so adept at surviving in rough environments, that not only the ultraviolet radiation from going through space back to Earth, but then the fire from re-entering Earth's atmosphere may not be enough to kill them off. And as such, well, we could be bringing back exciting and exotic bacteria, amongst other things. Another less, let's say, obvious issue is going to be simply contamination. That is, humans will also be taking microbes from Earth to space, particularly if humans are directly involved rather than being robotic or remote-controlled systems, and these could contaminate anything that we're trying to deal with, for example ice from the moon, to try and compare it to other sources of ice in space, such as asteroids. The fun news item we have for you is all about Mars, but it's going to be something that's a challenge for us when we actually want to go to Mars. The moon's already hard enough, but Mars may have toxic dust that could pose a huge health risk for any kind of Martian explorer, which kinda adds to the concerns we have about the Watney Protocol and growing potatoes on Martian soil. But the problem here is, first of all, that Martian dust storms are a huge respiratory risk and they can cause all sorts of issues. Just imagine trying to breathe in a dust storm as it is, and now you have to make it worse because you're on another planet, oxygen levels are lower, and you have all sorts of other crap in that dust. Yeah. This is one of the reasons why dust storms are a massive problem for any robotic mission to Mars. They can destroy solar panels and completely obliterate anything that is there to make it work. This includes not only the panels themselves, but all the electronics that are involved too. Of course, this does get worse again because, well, if you're in space, things are going to get worse, and it's that although storms by themselves are bad, they are typically localized. And typically being the key word, because every 5.5 years, they're not. The entirety of the Martian surface is covered in huge dust storms. And, well, you can see them from Earth if you have a good enough telescope. And as a result, well, we basically lose rovers every, roughly 5.5 years. That's how opportunity and insight were both lost. And the worry with the, at least planet-wide storm, is that dust kicked up is largely made up of silica, and silica causes silicosis, which is a kind of disease related to exposure to silicon. Now, most people on Earth would be exposed to this from something like, say, mining or construction work. But, in this case, it's from being an astronaut, which does seem a little bit ironic, but nonetheless. The problem with it is that those who have had it know it perhaps more commonly by the name black lung, and that sort of tells you how bad it is. It's a buildup of the various inorganic matter within the lung that just can't be gotten rid of, and this causes damage to it over time, and that damage does add up fairly quickly. These are just a couple of the challenges, if not outright barriers, that any Martian expedition will face and attempt to colonize Mars. And the Universe Today article goes through considerably more that are worth reading into to see not only how they're trying to deal with them, but what sort of barriers will need to be overcome before Elon Musk has his way with Mars. That's all the news we have for you this week. Thank you for watching. If you found it interesting, consider liking, sharing, and subscribing. And please do post any comments, questions, or suggestions you have below.